Hey guys, how's it going? In today's video, I'm going to be sharing with you my process for creating my mixed media illustrations from the initial sketches, to color comps, to ink, and so on. If you've been around my channel for any time at all, you know I love ice cream.
Very much.
The idea for this piece came to me in the shower. I swear I do think outside of the shower, but apparently not as well. But anyways, it started first with the pose. I really wanted to draw a character like so ready to get her ice cream that she's already started eating it while she's still paying for it. I knew this was going to be a semi-complicated pose with the twist in her shoulders, so I took some very attractive reference photos of myself and drew the pose like 5 times to try to familiarize myself with it. Some of them turned out a little terrifying, but I finally sketched one out that I was really happy with. And this was shortly after I got my dip pen, so of course, I inked it. As you'll see, I stuck really close to the original colors in the finished illustration as I did in my sketchbook. I've found that using markers in my sketchbook really helps me brainstorm my color schemes quicker and helps me be more playful with the colors that I choose. So I finally started to build the scene around the character and decided to create a bit of an ocean view. My dad and I recently watched Luca, so the buildings on the island in the background were very heavily inspired by that. Once I decided on the Italian architecture, I figured why not make it a gelato stand as well? I used some of my tricks that I talked about in my video on designing engaging backgrounds to help me finish out my sketch. So I added some vinery and some bricks peeking out from the chipped paint on the wall, and a little chalkboard sign to the stand, and at this point I was ready to head on to the color and lighting comp stage. So of course I did exactly what a lot of artists say not to do, which is doing only one comp. But I was extremely happy with how it turned out and was really itching to start painting. I wanted to use some of the lighting effects that I learned in my schoolism class for this piece, so I turned it into a sunset so I could play with some light blooms around her face. Would the sea still be this sort of jade green at sunset? Debatable. But I liked it, so I printed it out my sketch and began transferring it to my paper. For this illustration, I decided to use my Arches hot press watercolor paper because I really wanted to learn more about watercolor textures and see what kind of effects I could create. The smoother paper would also be easier to use with my ink pen and would be easier to use colored pencils on later on. I first traced the sketch using my light box, then began my most favorite part, inking. I have fallen so hard for ink, and I am 100% okay with that. There's something very exciting about ink as a medium. I think maybe it just makes me feel like a little bit of a daredevil because once it's on there, there is no going back.
Ink will be there till you die.
Unfortunately, this also includes smudges. So I slowly began lining the piece, but it just felt a little bit stiff, too kind of pristine, like a coloring page or something. So I took a peek at some of my favorite ink artists and tried to use some of their tips and tricks to really make my line art more interesting. So I added some cross-hatching in areas that I knew would be in shadow.
Thank you, Past Alley, for doing a color and light comp.
I added some speckly bits around the ground and on the wall, and I added more variants on line weight throughout the rest of the piece. Once I was happy with the line art, I went into tones. This is where I kind of shot myself in the foot a little bit. The sepia ink I used was grayer than I wanted it to be, and that definitely made an impact on the watercolors later on. So I laid down several washes of ink to create a kind of underpainting for the piece. I tried not to be too controlling in this stage because I really wanted to let the fun effects of ink really shine and go where it wanted to on the page. So in the area where the wall casts a shadow on the ground, I laid down a wash of clean water and started to slowly add ink at the top of it so it would drain down and create a kind of blooming shadow gradient. I also added a few extra drops of ink in some areas to create some stony texture. So when I create gouache illustrations, I usually do an underpainting to map out my values. So like I said earlier, that's what I was trying to do here. But because watercolor is a very transparent medium, the gray tones of the ink really affected how the washes of watercolor looked on top. The colors were much more muted. Thankfully, I wasn't too concerned about this since I already knew I could brighten it up with colored pencils later, but it was definitely a learning experience. Several of you have asked how I get such vibrant colors with watercolor, and I do have a few tips about that. Number 1, buy Good Watercolors. Can't stress this enough.
Walmart watercolors will crush your soul into 1,000 pieces and leave you with a chalky, dull painting from hell.
I'm using my Shin hand watercolors, and honestly, they're fantastic, especially for the price. Are they professional grade? No, probably not. But they do mix really well, and the colors are gorgeous. You don't need a $300 set of watercolor paints, but you do want to get some decent ones. Number 2, don't overmix. The more you mix your colors, the muddier they will get. Doing my scene studies has really helped my knowledge of color theory and developed my color mixing skills, so I had fairly decent aim in mixing my colors for this piece. So I guess that would be like tip 2.5. Practice your color theory and gain confidence to mix colors. Of course, I still overmixed a few times and had to mix up a new color. That's kind of just part of the process. Painting is a lot of trial and error. Number 3 is kind of a cheater's tip, I guess. Don't be afraid to mix your medias. If you went too heavy on a shadow or muddied up a section of color, bring in some colored pencils or some gouache. You are not obligated to only use watercolor in your illustrations.
This is your art. You get to make the rules.
So because I had done an underpainting, I was able to simply start adding big washes of color to the piece. I did end up going back into a few areas to bring back some saturation where the underpainting had grayed it down, but there were several areas that I did one wash and left it at that. I added a couple pops of color in the shadow under the stand, liked how it looked, and didn't touch it again. I think that's one of the ways I've grown in my art this year, is in making decisions and being confident with them. Art doesn't have to cost you dozens of hours and lots of stress. If you like how something looks and it only took you a couple seconds to do, there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. As my mom always used to tell me with math,
don't make things harder than they need to be.
So I used a liquid latex gum stuff. I know there's a term for it. Masking fluid, that's what it is. I used a masking fluid over a few areas that I wanted untouched by the watercolor, so like the sun and the light blooms around the character's face. But I discovered pretty quickly after I started painting that I had gone too heavy on the line art for the light blooming to make any sense, so I figured out a way to fix that later. After finishing up with the watercolors, I took a step back and made note of what I wanted to add, change, or fix. I knew I had gone too heavy on her shorts and lost some of the line art, so I wanted to bring that back in. The line art around her face and her back arm and a few other areas was too strong, so I knew gouache would be a good solution to fix that problem. I also wanted the back wall lighter, some polka dots on the bandana, lettering for the chalkboard sign. This is where mixed media really shines. You get to pick and choose your mediums and play to each of their strengths. I love ink because it's bold and it draws your attention. I like watercolors because they're delicate and create beautiful textures. I love gouache because it's substantial and adds a weight to my paintings. And I love colored pencils because they're vibrant and easy to work with. Instead of confining myself to one medium and finishing a piece using just that medium, I can have fun and experiment with the different techniques of different mediums. I think I've realized part of why I love art so much is because I've always loved logic puzzles, and illustrations are just one big logic puzzle. I like figuring out a piece, backtracking when I've taken a wrong step, and designing something interesting. So I think adding the finishing touches probably takes me the longest because it's a lot of me making a mark, sitting and staring at it for 10 minutes, trying to figure out whether I've made it better or whether I've completely ruined it. So my intent for this piece was to try to capture the magic that I feel when I eat ice cream, but it really ended up becoming a lot more than that for me. I've struggled a lot finding my artistic voice over the years and have gone through several bouts of burnout that always take a little piece of my joy away from art. But this illustration was purely something I made for fun, with no product in mind, no video in mind, just me making something for the joy of it. And I think it's my favorite thing I've made in a really long time. So I've always wanted to visit Italy, and this piece kind of gave me the opportunity to explore it a little bit. I also really love vintage aesthetics and fashion, and I got to express that in this piece too. It was such a joy to just play around with my art supplies and make something out of the things that I already knew I loved. So I got to the end of this illustration, and I really liked it, but I just wanted something to really bring out a pop of magic in it. So I added these little, sun,
spot, dust, speck things. I don't know.
I added those around the character to help pull attention to her and express the magic that she's feeling. And with that, the illustration was finished. Thank you so much for watching, and I really hope y'all enjoyed watching my mixed media process for this illustration and maybe learned a little something. I still haven't figured out a title for it, but I'm kinda thinking something along the lines of sunset scoop. I don't know. Let me know what you think down in the comments. And speaking of scoops, if you like my art and want to see more of it, please consider joining the Scoop Troop over on Patreon. You get access to exclusive art posts, polls, and can get a monthly coloring page of my artwork.
Link down in the description.
Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on my videos, and I'll see you next week. Bye guys!